So here we are, sharing secrets of the soil with me, your host, Regenerative. Hello, soil lovers, Regenerative here, and welcome to another episode of Secrets of the Soil. Today, we are going to be going deep down the rabbit hole of permaculture. We are joined by David Holmgren, the co-creator of Permaculture. Welcome to the call.
Great to be here with you.
Excellent. For anyone who doesn't happen to know your name, can you share a little bit about how you fit into the landscape of permaculture and a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's David Holmgren, and I was the co-originator of the concept with Bill Mollison in the 1970s. When I was very young, I met Bill Mollison when I was 19, and he was a university senior tutor. And we developed a relationship completely outside of academia that was sort of partly, you would say, a student mentor, maybe master and apprentice, and even a small element of father and son. So it included debate and sort of argument and differences as well as collaboration. And for mostly, I think, better, that shaped my life. The publication of the manuscript that I worked on full-time in 75, 76, that became the basis of Permaculture One, which was published in 1978. And that book, and then the development of the permaculture design course that Mollison started teaching in 1980, sort of really launched permaculture as what has become a worldwide movement.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. You know, over 50 years of just kind of pure wisdom put into a book. I guess, why do you think that it took something like this pinnacle point of creating these concepts and the principles for people to understand that working with nature mattered?
Yeah, well, of course, it's important to understand what was going on in the 1970s. It was one of the great sort of turmoil periods, like the 1930s before it, that gave rise to the pioneering ideas of organics, and in Germany, biodynamics, and independently of that in Japan, of natural farming. That the 70s was a time where there was this huge cross-fertilization of ideas around environmental solutions, about how humanity needed to work with nature and not be constantly having the hubris that we knew better. So a lot of people would date the beginnings of that, of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the early 60s, and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968, but most powerfully, the Limits to Growth report of 1972. So that came out 2 years before I met Bill Mollison. And so there was this huge interest in what we would broadly call sustainable alternatives today. So not just ecological gardening and farming, but intentional communities and passive solar design, appropriate technology, all of these ideas. So to understand that, just thinking that 15 mainstream publishers approached a cantankerous and unknown academic and a completely unknown graduate student wanting to publish our manuscript in 1977. So, you know, it was a big wave of interest, and that sort of permaculture rode that wave into a sort of a populist adoption, which was right across the suburbs and everywhere, but really fell into a hole in the 80s as we got, with the Hawke-Keating government, a sort of a green-tinged, human-faced version of the Thatcherite, Reaganite neoliberal revolution. And that meant all of these ideas, from the sophisticated, you know, systems modelling of the limits to growth ideas, right through to fringe sort of backyard, you know, grow your own food, were demonized. You know, the first as being not understanding how markets and technology solve all our problems, and the latter idea has been demonized as hippie nonsense.
Yeah.
So, we've had several waves of adoption and, since then, and we're now pretty much in the extremity of the limits to growth crisis that's unfolding on multiple fronts. So as there's a lack of confidence in society's institutions and the conventional ways of doing things, the interest in things like permaculture actually come to the fore. So it's a sort of a pulsing pattern over the decades.
Yeah.
That's my quick systems history sort of view of, it's not just that Bill Mollison was a polymath and a great yarn spinner and, that these ideas were sort of fantastic. They sit in a context of, what's happening in society.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more with the fact that it feels a bit unstable and the institution's not sure if they've got the right, pathway forward. So I feel like we're at another interesting point in history. And I find it very interesting as well that you're talking about the early 70s. It's also when the gold got taken off the money standard as well. So we moved to a debt-based monetary system, and a lot of people don't realize that the current money system we have is only 50 something years old, so it's interesting that all these things happen. And then we had the green revolution, which, it's not so green when we're throwing all these chemicals on our farms. And so I find it interesting that there's this amazing book that's put together that proves and shows the way that we can do it naturally and with nature. And yet we have the green revolution, which is more about pushing nitrogen and fertilizers and making fields green and monoculture. Do you have any insights, or what's your thought of how these two narratives were side by side, but then ended up so far apart 50 years down the track?
Yeah, well, I think the battle to find the next pathway forward for industrial modernity, extracting from nature and building greater complexity in the sort of globalized industrial system, that when a system is built around that from the beginning, there's a huge amount of lock-in to sort of try and keep making it work. Yeah. And of course, a lot of ecological historians have pointed to the diminishing law of returns, but that the general problems with that, but also the residual affluence of society means that at times like that, a lot of people discontented with that paradigm experiment. And we can see that in the lineage of pioneering organic and regenerative farmers who've often run into a personal crisis or a crisis in their land management, and they've sort of been reduced in a sense to nothing and go, have to take a different pathway. So that sort of growth through the crisis, which is like health crisis for people, sometimes can trigger a fundamental change in the way they do things. Now, you can also see where people fall over as a result of those crises and just spiral down, including, that they don't survive, so that there's these huge loss processes as the system fails, but it also stimulates a lot of creativity at the fringes. And I think tragically, the sort of hybrid solutions between the mainstream and the fringe have actually become more difficult. It's a sort of more of a divided world, and that division can sometimes be around hard technical things that are reinforced by legal lock-in, like grain growers on a large scale are pretty much locked into the corporate system and increasingly into genetically engineered seed sources provided, or they're this sort of handful of broadacre producers who are biodynamic, organic, regenerative, and who are direct marketing through local networks. And it's really hard. There's not much space in the middle between those now. And, we can see that it's very hard also for a lot of, small organic producers to find that survival place in the current economy within all the rules and yet not be on that treadmill pathway up to being a supplier to moles and bullies. which is a dangerous and difficult place to be, even if you're actually successful. And at the other end, you've got the sort of the feral parallel food system of grow your own, farmers markets, community supported agriculture. But these crossovers still very much do exist, and there's but mostly they've sort of moved into like two different directions that harden I think over time.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that there's now especially there's more of an openness to explore different and to buy locally and understand where the farmer comes from. And there's a push for that narrative, but then inflation and the cost of everything causes people to default back to what have I got left in my back pocket to actually buy and survive, and it's that kind of value nightmare that people are having in their mind. And I think, activating people to grow, ask better questions, understand the food chain is the most we can ask for soil lovers out there listening, is to just go out there and explore and be inquisitive and educate yourself, because the mainstream ain't going to share the full wisdom on what's kind of happening. Now there's 12 principles of permaculture, and we don't need to rehash them because they're available everywhere online. But if there was like one thing that someone listening could start at, what would you feel is like the one that really hits someone in the heart and gives that kind of energy to move forward?
Well, in some ways, the first principle, observe and interact, is an antidote to this idea that we have to have our heads opened and knowledge poured into us to be able to do anything. And, it is actually, growing food is actually, complex, mysterious, site and situation specific, dependent on forms of knowledge systems that we're not used to through conventional education. We didn't actually create all of our farmers by sending them to agricultural college. They mostly sort of absorbed a lot of what they know osmotically, and then maybe they added that sort of other stuff on top. And similarly, having a nation of gardeners and then losing that knowledge over multiple generations, we don't have a clear recipe for how you recreate it. But what we do know is you have to reconnect to observing nature as just a default thing. It's like looking out the window at the weather as well as looking on the phone.
Yep.
And being connected and doing things rather than being a detached observer. So that confidence to just try stuff, make small mistakes. And, that all of our ancestors grew food, in often quite difficult situations. So I see that principle as an incredibly important starting point and empowerment point, that you don't have to have a university degree or, even have done a permaculture design course to try something, do something. So I would start there.
Yeah, I love that. And doing the permaculture living course that you did in partnership with Milkwood during COVID was, a real eye opener for me, because I was in an apartment in Melbourne during lockdown and I was trying to use my time the best I could. And doing something online like that really enabled me to kind of practice in my own little space, being a small balcony and being, and breaking that paradigm of you don't need access to land in order to learn the values and the principles. And, the observation principle number one, I think, is very powerful, because we use what we got for free. We don't need to kind of go and buy tools. We use our eyes, our ears, our touch, our taste, our smell. The 5 senses are the biggest tools we've got in order for us to make decisions. And I was able to do that from my apartment, looking out and seeing nature and making observations and hearing the sounds as well. That was really interesting. It's more than just visual. It's about hearing and smell and touch. And the further I've gone down that rabbit hole, the more I've explored that observation principle. Now, I'm also doing the permaculture design course, and so I'm very excited to hang out with you more. And I do believe that now you've moved it into an online experience. So share a little bit why that's happened, and is it a result of COVID, or do you think it's just time now that we move more online with these type of explorations and learnings?
Yeah, look, I suppose going back more than 20 years, sort of being a public intellectual connected to the world, living in rural Victoria, I thought for a long time that one of the great things about information technology is overcoming the tyranny of distance. And, in my RetroSuburbia work, critiqued of why is there all this commuting to these? This is completely unnecessary. This is bizarre. Why, and that houses aren't used during the day, And so I've always seen and always been connected online. We've had a website for, over 20 years, and that's always been part of our world. And there's no doubt that COVID accelerated both immediate necessity and opportunity for more people to sort of use and accept that way. But of course, there are substantial downsides that, this tension that it pulls us more into the machine, and reminds me a little bit of an early intern we had about 20 years ago, a guy who'd grown up beta testing game software with his parents, who were pioneers in computer software in the 70s, who had this idea that he would make this permaculture computer game that would lead to people turning off the machine and going outside into the garden. So there is this, this constant tension between those two realities. But I think the opportunities for people to do things in ways, like you said, with the permaculture living course that Milkwood have done, but also to just make accessible to more people, material that we've been teaching directly, some of which is in formats that are already digital, their presentations and whatever, and just how to craft those in combination with activities that people are doing themselves. So for us, it's a little bit of a small stepping stone, but it's also, we've already done that with taking our tour of our property Meliadora, that we've been running tours there for since the early 90s, actually. And that's been a very significant way of people being inspired and seeing some of the details of a whole permaculture system on our small property in central Victoria. But to have that accessible to people online is another way, in the same way that in the 90s we produced a big A4 landscape book documenting our place at a time when there was very few permaculture designs, like on paper, available to people as case studies. Because, most publishers, of course, only want to publish books that are, this is relevant everywhere, whereas the case study is sort of looks like an indulgence. But in a case study, you see how a real system actually integrates and deals with all of the idiosyncrasies of a real situation and real people, which makes it unique, of course. But you get that sort of feel of what the whole thing actually looks like in a particular context. And context is everything, whereas we're educated to think that we can just rubber stamp solutions, and it's never quite like that. So we did that documentation of our place as a self-published A3 landscape book, which still actually exists and is available on our website. And then in 2005, turned that into what we thought was going to be the format of ebooks before there were ebooks, which was an interactive PDF with pull-out menus and other media, but ebooks went off and did something else. So, we're used to playing with that and working with different ways of documenting and communicating permaculture. So, and especially in that, I'm working very closely with Beck Lowe, who was actually editor of the RetroSuburbia book, but she's also one of the most experienced permaculture teachers in Australia. And she's so used to working in so many different ways and formats, from, regular courses 1 day a week to residential courses, and that amazing flexibility that we can work with different formats. And of course, we've got fantastic teams of experienced teachers to sort of pull into that. But yeah, this is a sort of a first for us with the PDC, and it will evolve over time as well.
Yeah.
So you'll be doing the beta version, but
that's what I love.
I
love being a beta tester of things. I love being first. And it's interesting because you're talking about a lot of things that you were first to, innovating. You could, you had a website for a long time when probably people said you don't need a website. And, you're producing ebooks when they're interactive. And even though ebooks didn't go down to that era, and now they're just static PDFs with no embedded videos and no buttons, and that, you were there in the early. Is that how your brain has been kind of wired? Do you feel like you're an early adopter to these type of things, or you can see what's going on?
I think it's actually a mixture between that and what people might look at as Luddite resistance. For example, we ran, business through the 90s without a fax machine. It just didn't go there, and then went straight to email. Bypassed the fax machine basically, which is, and like I'm not personally on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or any of those things that, which is sort of like death for a public intellectual in a way. But, so I sort of pick and choose personally, and I suppose that is carried over into both communication strategy broadly in how permaculture can contribute to a better world, and how we can play, and I can play my small part in what is, the permaculture world, and also business strategy in terms of survival, how you earn a livelihood through those processes. So rather than, you must have this and you must do that, all of those sort of rules of business, I suppose, being pretty iconoclastic about that, and prone to sort of do the opposite in some cases of what is the received wisdom. And that doesn't mean to say, you're always right and it always works out. But so it's a mix, I suppose, of early adopter and Luddite skeptic.
Yeah, nice. It reminds me of a little thing that I saw a while back. Where it's like, when they zig, you zag. If everyone's using vacuum seams, you don't. And I like that because it's like, yeah, it's definitely a way of kind of standing out and pattern interrupting as well. It's like, how do I send that to you? Oh, you have to email it. It's like, we only got faxes. Now we're on the other end of that. Someone wanted me to fax something the other day. I was like, what? Really? You're still using faxes in the medical industry? What are we doing? So it's just crazy.
Yeah, well, that also reflects a bit when everyone's doing this, quietly walk the other way, is of course a reflection of the permaculture principle of use edges and value the marginal. And the proverb we use for that is, don't think you're on the right track just because it's a well-beaten path. So it's not necessarily a guarantee of success, but that skepticism about whatever is the current fashion or thing, or the group think that prevails in society, being a little bit inoculated against that, is been a big part of how, I've worked in the world.
Awesome. Soil lovers, I love this conversation. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about RetroSuburbia a little bit more and how permaculture can solve many of the world's problems at the moment. So stick with us. Hello, soil lovers. I hope you're enjoying today's guest and this podcast, but I wanted to just let you know that when you get excited about soil, just as you're hearing about our guests, then you will want to check out the Soil Learning Centre. The Soil Learning Centre is a hub that we put together and digitalized all the content over the years that were originally on DVD into this online learning experience. So if any of our guests or any of the topics that we speak about during the podcast whet your appetite and you want to get your hands dirtier and dig deeper and get educated around different things around soil, whether it be biodynamics, permaculture, whether it be using a microscope, or whether it just be hanging out with other like-minded educators, mentors, and facilitators, then the Soil Learning Centre is a place for you to hang out and dig deeper. That's the soillearningcentre.com. We have lots of different programs, courses, and even a membership. So if you want to belong to a community of other soil lovers, then that's the place to hang out. Well, until we meet again, enjoy the rest of this podcast. Back to the program. Welcome back, soil lovers. You're hanging out with David and Regen Ray. We're talking about permaculture. And David, I know that you have a view that permaculture can be a way of solving many of the problems in the world and, you know, where things are a bit off track. So what do you mean by that? Like, how can permaculture as a principle and a way of living kind of solve some of the things that are not feeling right in the world at the moment?
Yeah, well, because permaculture is a design system for both regenerative land use and resilient living, it's concerned with both the production side of the equation, how we get our needs from nature, and how we organise ourselves and what we do. The great opportunities, especially in what I call the overdeveloped world of the long affluent countries like Australia, is that there's so much fat in the system. There's so much of the economy and ways of doing things are actually unnecessary. You know, and you can get down to the very mundane of people setting out the dinner plates and the bread and butter plates and the soup bowls and doing, you know, a meal like the Queen's coming and creating a whole lot of unnecessary washing up, you know, whereas in a sense we need to downsize and just live like peasants a bit more, you know, and do less washing up.
Yeah.
You know, right through to we've got the biggest houses in the world that are hardly used and that people are away working to pay them off or pay off the underlying land value. How do we re-energise larger shared households in those larger houses to be powerhouses of household and community non-monetary economy? Because it's way more efficient. Now, if you said that to people, you know, in the Carlton Terrace house we used to rent in the 80s, that when it was built in the 1890s and there was already 8 or 9 people living in it, you know, get a bigger household, you know, be more efficient. Well, sorry, we're already full. Whereas you look at that Carlton Terrace house now, so it's probably got 1 or 2 people in it and they're never there. You know, so, and then we extend it to things like the extraction of resources out of the earth. And if you look at things like stainless steel and aluminium, we've got enough stainless steel in the world already. It just needs to be reused from things that are no longer needed for, which, as I said, is most of the discretionary economy. And from the beginning, permaculture involved a lot of these ideas of, oh, you know, that's a problem. That's a waste product. Oh, what can we use that for? So the development of sheet mulch gardening, just using abundance of wasted organic materials, either from farming. I don't know how farms could ever see that organic materials were a waste, but that's where we ended up.
Yeah.
Because that's the way the economy works, through to the offshoots of manufacturing. And, you know, back in the 70s, Mollison and I used to go to the Cadbury's factory and get the cocoa bean husks and, you know, the barrels that Jamaican rum came in, all sorts of, you know, the reusing and the opportunities to use something, that creative reuse, the huge opportunities, right through to, you know, creative container housing or very modest things in the garden, how our ancestors in garden agriculture always needed a bamboo patch, a small patch of forest where you got small bits of wood where you can create trellis structures. There's lots of structures that are needed in garden farming. And you need to get that from fast-growing renewable materials. well, we can recreate all those things, and we do, with fast-growing trees, and we use flax in the garden for tying up things rather than baling twine and bamboo. But, we can also go off to the tip and get amazing cast-off industrial materials that our ancestors never had available. So that ability to sort of repurpose, creatively reuse, I think is one of the big ways in which permaculture can help get us over this hump from the fossil fuel globalized industrial systems to a sort of a gentler pathway where maybe our descendants will then again be dependent on the slowly renewing cycles of nature.
Very magical to hear some of the things that you're saying. And it brings me back to my childhood, because when I was growing up, I never knew that we're going to call it in the future RetroSuburbia. But exactly what you shared there, like my grandparents came to Australia in the 60s and they set up their property in Reservoir, Melbourne, Victoria.
Right.
And there was no grass. It was all veggie patches.
Wow.
It was the chicken coop in the back corner, the shed with all the recycled jars for all the nails and the bolts. And there's a small patch which grows bamboo. And the bamboo is cut down, dried, and used as stakes for the beans and to make trellis. And it was a circular economy in my own backyard. And I didn't know that that's what I was growing up in. And it was almost a bit weird, because it's like no one else had gardens like that. They were playing cricket and soccer. We couldn't do that at my grandparents' house because we would damage a lettuce leaf, or we would break a tomato stem. And we'd get brooms thrown across the yard because we were like in trouble, So it was very interesting to see. And now fast forward, I'm very grateful for having that upbringing, because I see so many people turning to this RetroSuburbia movement, and how do they get chickens for eggs, and my grandparents were selling dozens of eggs for $2 to the neighbors. And they were raised by the village back in Italy. There was a communal plot, and everyone went there during the day, and who milked the cow and who cut the lettuce and who shared everything. And it was a barter economy. It was all there for the commons, and they tried to bring that here, but it didn't work in the village, in the community. It only worked in their own backyard across all their kids and their family. And so when you explain that, I can completely relive my childhood of like how all this kind of works together. How excited are you the fact that RetroSuburbia is getting a lot more traction and people are wanting to start these kind of mini oases in their own backyard?
Yeah, well, I think it reveals that huge potential there is for people to just act on their own territory without having a whole lot of stakeholders or approval processes or whatever, for society to sort of agree that it needs to go in a different direction, just like your sort of grandparents did in the context of sort of, even back then, relatively affluent Aussies, sort of, who were maybe a generation before doing stuff like that, but had already sort of moved into the better consumer world. So I think that is the power of RetroSuburbia, and the storytelling version that gave rise to that, of course, which is my Aussie Street story, to actually tell this shared lived history of what suburbia has been, rather than this sort of negative, dead picture of all the bad things about it, without it all romanticizing that, just understanding all of that dynamic and understanding how powerful a foundation the household and community non-monetary economy is for any society's survival. But not that we can do everything at the backyard scale, but that we have to massively increase doing things at that scale and pull a lot of that activity that's currently happening in earth-destroying ways out of the monetary economy. And of course, that's basically economic treason, because it results in a decline in GDP, in monetary transactions. And that's why these solutions are actually never supported by sort of mainstream government policies. They might happen as a byproduct of some other sort of response to symptoms, in the way that community gardens were supported primarily through the 90s because of community development and health values. But actually, economic self-reliance that wasn't actually something that you could actually sell to government policies, because that reduces the amount that people shop.
Yep. Totally. I know. No wonder why we're here. It just, yeah, absolutely. It just, you can totally zoom out and see that, how we've ended up here. And unfortunately, we are at a point now where everyone thinks that government or regulation or policies are going to fix it. And that's what I like about your Aussie Street presentation. And I've seen it where you've presented it live and watched it online as well, where, there's a little bit of a sneakiness of like, ask for forgiveness, not permission.
Yeah, well, this is actually part of the strategy of RetroSuburbia, why I focus on the suburbs, because it is possible to do things in small ways where, if you are ethically focused around, okay, who is going to be adversely affected by what I do? Oh, well, maybe potentially the neighbour might not like it. Well, if I have a good relationship with the neighbour, then that's the social license. Yep. And I say that's more important than the legal license. Whereas when I'm talking about a corporation using millions of dollars via the banks to do something, the chances of that having adverse impacts is very, very high. And the chances of that corporation having an ethical constraint on what it does other than the law is zero. Yeah. And that's why we need tighter regulation at that big end and free things up at the bottom. And so in my public presentations, sponsored by councils, sometimes with the mayor there or some, would tell people, because people often ask, what am I allowed to do? Yeah. And no, think if you're doing something small scale in self-interest and you can see how this is actually not adversely affecting other people, then if you build those relationships and you have that support, it's unlikely for you to have problems. And then, yes, there's the asking for forgiveness. And, we have that other strategy that if we were organised in a way with the radical solidarity that we associate with actual political action, often whether it's radical environmental or political action in the common space, if we actually mobilise that solidarity to support people who maybe had a functioning compost toilet in their backyard, but it's actually illegal, and imagining some scenario where the council actually fines them. Imagine if we actually supported those people, that solidarity could actually be that next step of, instead of just asking for forgiveness, of actually resistance and change. And I think that sort of radical solidarity has a greater potential to be supported by more ordinary, socially conservative people than when, as Extinction Rebellion activists, people chain themselves, stopping people commuting to work or something. Because when we do things for ourselves, a lot of people say, well, they're not forcing that on someone else. They're just doing it for themselves. So RetroSuburbia includes the seeds of a sort of more radical social change constituency, but it doesn't start from having to have all of that great plan and vision in place for it to be useful and practical for the people doing it. And that's often the failing in radical political activism, where people are sacrificing themselves for the cause, but they're not actually getting real gain themselves. And of course, that then leads to sort of burnout
and the gap in the narrative. The mainstream media jumps on that and be like, thousands of commuters were late to work today because of 6 people who stood in front of the tunnel. It's like, I get the cause and I agree, but you're right. It actually widens the gap, because now you've got thousands of people going, how dare they, these, in activists, da, da, da. It's such a, there was a time where people were going and opening up, farm gates to let the animals out. It's like, it caused so much more destruction than the message you're trying to get across, And so I totally agree. And, be the change you want to see. And then once you're that change, people can model you. And it's a much more, holistic way of getting a message across and living, aligned to your values. And I'm excited to do the permaculture course, because I feel like this is going to, leap me leaps and bounds forward to the way that I'm thinking, and just being around, the biodiversity of people, the others. And even though it's online, I think it's going to be quite exciting, because I'm a big advocate of online learning, as much as getting out on the field is really important as well. I think it's really good because having that tool there as a refresher, or something that you can go lean on to as a reminder, even post-course, I think is going to be a real, useful tool. So if anyone's thinking of doing the permaculture course with you, I know the current intake, which is going to happen in August 2022, is already full, and congratulations on that. But what's the next steps? How do people hang out with this course and get more into your world?
Well, we've got quite a lot of online resources these days, including, as I said, the tour of Meliadora, and plans for other online courses. And there's also, for those who are in the central Victorian region, we're still planning our regular in-person course next year at the local ashram in Rockland. We'll have details of that developing. And of course, the other part of our work is continuing to support the development of published resources, and the most substantial of that recently has been a long journey with Rosemary Morrow's new book, Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture, which has been 6 years in the making, a much more than an update of her Earth Users Guide to Permaculture. So we're continuing to work in that way to provide resources at lots of different levels for people's permaculture journeys. And our great experiment in staying outside of the online supermarkets of Amazon and co, doing what no one else is attempting to do, of direct network marketing and working with small bookshops. So all of our colleagues running those systems to support the ecosystems of small permaculture and kindred networks in whatever way we can.
I love that. There's so many ways, and there'll always be links around the video and the podcast if you want to go and hang out. And I do believe that you've got a waiting list for the next intake, whatever that is, for the online version, but also really interesting to know that you're still running the physical events. Out of curiosity, maybe a little bit for myself, will people who do the online course get an ability to come on to any of the physical events at, in the future? As a bit of
well, Becklow's been talking about a hybrid possibility in the future of online elements, and then gathering for some weekends of tours to properties, so it's people can come together for that period. But we're still sort of working on all of those pathways, and I'm trying to work out how to also slow down and just support my other colleagues and younger people do a lot of these things as well.
Yeah, love that. I think it's awesome to have this new generation of people coming in and get excited about that. And with your years in this kind of journey and story, have you seen the younger generation change their values and uptake this at a different rate lately? And has COVID and the current world economic climate change that?
Yeah, well, I think for a number of years, even now, over the last 20 years, I've seen the acceleration of people doing what Rob Hopkins of the transition movement said, the great reskilling. The number of people learning, whether it's growing vegetables or fermenting foods, or collecting edible weeds and mushrooms, right through to various aspects of ecological building, that there's a faster learning cycle that's happened through a combination of that now there's several generations of people trying to learn these things from scratch, sometimes without having inherited them from their parents, and also the online learning tools of things like YouTube and stuff, and also a more radical energizing of young people about we really need to do something different. And I think COVID has been both an advance and a setback, that some people have been, pulled back into the box. Gee, we really are dependent on the centralized system, and health, as I've said in the RetroSuburbia book, the health chapter was the last I wrote, because in a sense I always saw it as the weakest link in people trying to live in this more grounded way, and health crises often lead to people being drawn back into a dependence on the system. But it's also energized a lot of people, especially young people, to see how severe those limitations and constraints are, and a stronger commitment to, no, we need to be doing all that too. What is the basis of maintaining health as much as possible outside of the centralized systems of control?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that this is a bit of a convergence happening, where all these crossroads are kind of coming together, and people are in this space of collaborating and leaning on community and questioning where things are. David, are you ready to become the voice of our soils? This is our signature question. You're going to embody the soil, and you're going to become the soil, and you're going to become the voice of the soil. What would you say to all of us on the planet Earth from the heart of the soil?
Well, soil, us, me, we, are nature's great innovation for life to actually come out of the sea, where it had lived for thousands of millions of years, and colonize all this rocky rest of the planet that nothing could live on. And so soil is that amazing invention that solves the problem of how to catch water and nutrients and hold those precious things in intimate balance so life is possible. And so it is nature's, Gaia's greatest innovation, because for hundreds and more thousands of millions of years, life was confined to the sea.
Yeah. So
although it's not the whole world, because there's another universe that exists in the watery realm, we are creatures of the land, and soil is that invention by which all of those things work.
Amazing, beautiful. And I love the fact that you said us, we, and me. It's all together, and it really is the foundation of life, and took us back to that kind of visualization of it all kind of being just, soil, and in the right condition, that seed germinated. And people are seeing that on regenerative farms, where they're bringing the soil life back, and all of a sudden there's a native grass that they never sowed, they never seeded, they never saw in the area, and here it is, And I would argue that there's more groundbreaking discoveries on regenerative farms than conservation parks that are locked up and got millions of dollars thrown at it. So
yeah, and certainly soil is still the greatest mystery, and the fact that many of these things are mysteries means that although there's endless amounts we can learn, it's also being just directly connected to that mystery and wonder of soil and how it supports fertility and how it supports us, and being appreciative of that, as all our ancestors needed to be every day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, for hanging out with us and talking all about RetroSuburbia, permaculture, and being the voice of the soil for this particular episode. As I mentioned before, all the links to hang out with David and doing the other courses around permaculture, and who else to do it with than one of the kind of creators and founders of the whole principles. And kudos to you for being an innovator and a pioneer in those early days, where I'm sure a lot of people called you crazy, and now we're all asking you, how did you do it?
Great to talk to you, Ray.
Excellent. Well, there you go, soil lovers. Until next time, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into our wonderful world of soils. Stay curious. Wait, before you hit the skip button, if you're a soil lover and love listening to my podcast, then I want you to discover more by getting access to my Patreon, where I share behind the scenes and bonus content that doesn't always make the conversations on the podcast. So head over to secretsofthesoil.com/support, where for a very small fee, you get to hang out with me and other soil lovers, where we get to geek out about soil and get access to exclusive content. It's very exclusive. No, not really. It's just a lot of fun and a way that we get to support this podcast together in order so that we can have deeper conversations all about soil from mentors all around the world. So what are you waiting for? Go on, show your support and token appreciation for this podcast. Until next time, cheers. Well, soil lovers, that's enough secrets for one episode. I really hope that you enjoyed all the secrets shared during this conversation. But hey, let's not keep it a secret. Please share this podcast around and make sure that you like it and leave us a review, because that really helps spread the secrets of the soil. Until next time, remember, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into your soils.